Hi, I'm Dr. Steve Klien from the Department of Communication at the University of Missouri. This video is the second in a two-part series that discusses the relationship between language, symbolic meaning, and political ideology. In the first video in this series, we took a more general look at how symbolic language carries meaning through the theories of the semantic triangle and semiotic theory regarding signs and reference. What we're going to do in this video is focus a bit more specifically on strategic ways in which language and its meaning can be deployed in public discourse, specifically in political rhetoric. And then we're going to take a look at how the abstraction function of strategic language use can have the effect of inviting and developing specific worldviews and ideological perspectives and commitments on the part of those who use that language. But first, let's just take a minute or two for some quick review from last time. We introduced an argument made by political scientist Murray Edelman, where he says it is language about political events and developments that people experience. Even events that they are close to take their meaning from the language used to depict them. So political language is political reality. There is no other so far as the meaning of events to actor and spectators is concerned. Because politics deals with a number of important ideas, literally matters of life and death, that nonetheless are abstract concepts that can't be objectively held and seen and measured, political language and the ways in which we interpret it are really the only way we have to negotiate these important political decisions. So we need to attend to how language conveys meaning in political discourse, and we also have to think about the strategic ways in which this happens. We talked about two layers of meaning in our last video that are pretty helpful. The first is denotative meaning, or denotation, the direct, literal, official meaning of a symbol, the kind of meaning that you would find if looking for a definition in the dictionary. The other form of meaning we talked about is connotative meaning, the cluster of beliefs, feelings, value positions, and so forth that attach to our experience with a symbol, such as a word or a collection of words. Now, it's connotative meaning that's going to have a lot of importance for us in our discussion of the potential political impacts of strategic language use. And we're going to explore that in a little bit more detail in this video. So, how is it that language actually goes about constructing meaning in strategic ways? Political rhetorician Dan Hahn talks about two concepts in his book on political communication that are helpful for us. The first is defining, applying a term to stand for a concept and providing reasons for it. This is the sort of discourse that aims at establishing a denotative meaning for a concept, to limit what a word means so that everyone that's involved in the conversation has a clear sense of it and can be on the same page. For instance, let's take the following statement. By allowing citizens to speak and worship as they wish, America defends freedom. Now, what this sentence does is it provides a definition of freedom. What is freedom? Well, it involves some specific civil rights, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, as well as the capacity of citizens to be able to act on that freedom without external constraints. So the meaning of freedom in this kind of definition is very specific. And if both parties agree to the definition, then you can move forward from that point with that definition as a premise for continued argument. Now, of course, if you disagree with the definition, then we can engage in discourse over what the competing definitions of the concept are so that we can try to build towards some understanding. However, language can also be used strategically to broaden the meaning of a concept. Indeed, to use language deliberately, ambiguously, in order to enable people to provide a multitude of different meanings to a word. This is what Hahn refers to as naming, applying a term to stand for a concept, but not providing a reason for it. Let's use a real-life example to illustrate naming using the concept we talked about in our previous example. After the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the United States, President George W. Bush instituted the global war on terror. This was initially a military intervention in Afghanistan against the Taliban regime in order to root out terrorists and to disrupt the harboring and resource provision for terrorists that were being conducted by that radical government. But the global war of terror went on to engage in other counter-terrorist activities around the world, particularly in Africa, Central Europe, and the Middle East. The code word for the global war on terror that was used by the Department of Defense and the U.S. military was Operation Enduring Freedom. Now, there was no specific denotation of what freedom meant in this particular context that came from the Department of Defense. So when you hear the phrase Operation Enduring Freedom, what does that mean? Well, enduring freedom is a freedom that lasts a long time. Okay, fine. But what freedoms are we talking about? Are we talking about freedom of speech and freedom of religion, as we did in the previous definition? Or are we talking about other kinds of freedoms? Perhaps not freedom to do things, but perhaps freedom from things. For instance, freedom from fear, or freedom from risk to life and limb as the result of an attack from an outside power. And are we talking about freedom of United States citizens who are being threatened by terrorists? Or are we talking about the freedom of the Afghani people that are currently being held captive by their own government, the tyrannical Taliban regime? It could be all of these things. It could be some of these things. It's left deliberately ambiguous. Because freedom is one of those words in U.S. political culture that is really powerful from the standpoint of the core values and principles of what drives our national identity. Virtually no one is against freedom in U.S. political culture. So you hear a phrase like Operation Enduring Freedom, it sounds inherently positive. Different people will bring their own interpretations of what Operation Enduring Freedom means, but all of them accomplish the same goal, which is to garner popular support for a military action because it seems to be promoting the right sort of moral values, the right sort of principles that are definitive of our national political culture. So this is just one example of how the naming strategy uses deliberately ambiguous language in order to be politically strategic. Now, whether we're using defining to limit the meaning of a concept, or we're using naming to broaden and make ambiguous the meaning of a concept, the same kind of principle of how language means things is at play here. And that particular concept is described by literary scholar William Lutz in his book, The New Doublespeak, as abstraction. Language use focuses attention on certain features and similarities to the exclusion of others. Because, as complex symbols, words can potentially mean lots of different things depending on how they're used, to whom, in what context, language can be used strategically in such a way that encourages the audience to think about it in certain terms and not really to think about the other ways in which it might be used. What's important to emphasize here, though, is the power that language has by focusing our attention on certain important elements of reality and downplaying our attention on other elements of reality, that the ways in which we use our symbolic vocabularies can really have a profound impact on the way in which we look at the world. For instance, in the middle 20th century, Sapir-Whorf developed a theory of language that explains, for instance, why certain indigenous populations that live in the Arctic Circle have dozens of different words for snow, whereas some of us that live in the Midwestern United States may have just a few. The reason that this happens is explained by Sapir-Whorf in their theory. They hold that every language incorporates certain points of view and certain patterned resistances to widely divergent points of view. If you live in a particular place that emphasizes certain aspects of reality, we develop vocabularies that define and name and otherwise identify and label and explain those things that are important to us. And subsequently, we can move in the opposite direction as well. We have difficulty identifying and conceptualizing and making sense of things if we don't really have the language resources to be able to articulate it effectively. So, for instance, in the Arctic Circle, lots and lots of different words to describe different kinds of snow because that's something that's very important for them. Not so much for us here in Middle Missouri. The implication of the Sapir-Whorf theory is important. Essentially, symbol systems constitute a worldview, a perspective for understanding and interpreting reality. This is a notion that can be very important politically, because especially in the development of mass-mediated propaganda in the early to mid-20th century, as well as in the refinement of marketing and focus group strategies to develop certain ways of talking in political discourse in the later part of the 20th century, the ways in which language can be used strategically to construct a specific worldview intentionally can be pretty dramatic. This concept that Sapir and Whorf are articulating about the relationship between symbol systems and a worldview was very helpfully summed up by rhetorical theorist Kenneth Burke, where he stated, "Even if any given terminology is a reflection of reality, by its very nature as a terminology, it must be a selection of reality, and to this extent must function also as a deflection of reality." Now, besides being a clever turn of phrase, this is kind of a profound idea. What Burke is arguing here is that even when we try to use language or other forms of symbolic meaning to simply depict what we believe is as objective reality, there's no way that we could actually accurately and completely encompass all of the possible dimensions of reality with single words or even with an entire vocabulary. So even if we're just trying to describe what is, we are necessarily being selective. We're engaged in what Lutz called abstraction. We're selecting certain aspects of it that we're emphasizing, and other aspects of it we're ignoring or just leaving off to the side as less important. Sometimes we do this intentionally, sometimes it's unintentionally, but it's just something that comes more or less naturally to us based on the society and culture that we live in. And what's important about using language or any symbolism selectively is that means that certain aspects of reality are going to be deflected. They're going to be left out. And again, this can be done on purpose, strategically, or it could be done by oversight based on the way that we've been conditioned to look at the world. Check out this real-life example as an illustration of how this works. In 1990, the Republicans in the House of Representatives and the Senate were very concerned about the possibility that growing dissatisfaction with the Republicans in government might potentially erode the success that they had had politically with the election of Ronald Reagan as president, followed up by the election of George H.W. Bush as president in 1988. So when preparing for subsequent midterm elections, particularly for the House of Representatives, GOPAC, which was a political action committee that was organized by prominent Republican Congressman Newt Gingrich, distributed a pamphlet to their supporters entitled Language, a Key Mechanism of Control. And the basic idea behind this pamphlet was to provide symbolic language resources for political organizers in the Republican Party in the grassroots to try to develop ways in which their supporters and subsequently the media that were covering their campaigns to talk about the issues that they wanted to have talked about. The strategy was simple. When talking to reporters, when talking to members of the public, when talking about people who might be supporting your party, you want to be able to use the same kinds of language in the same kinds of ways. So, for instance, when you're talking about fellow Republicans, such as Republican candidates running for office, you would use positive governing words. Words like change, opportunity, truth, moral, courage, prosperity, children, family, active, inclusive words like we, us, and our, liberty, commitment, principle, unique, duty, precious, tough. You can see how the strategy was designed. Anytime you talk about Republicans, you want to have people make psychological associations to these kinds of words, because these kinds of words are intrinsically positive, what theorists like Kenneth Burke and Richard Weaver would refer to as God terms. These are words that are ambiguous. They potentially could mean different kinds of things to different kinds of people, but in our U.S. political culture, get a positive reaction from those that hear them and use them. These Republican organizers were instructed that when talking about Democrats to use contrasting words so that the differences between Republicans and Democrats could be drawn very clearly. So when talking about Democrats, you use words like decay, failure, collapse, crisis, destroy, sick, pathetic, lie, betray, endanger, threaten, devour, corrupt, selfish, and so forth. And the strategy is supposed to work in much the same way. If you're always talking to the media using these kinds of words when referring to Democrats, and you're always talking to potential supporters this way when talking about Democrats, the idea is that this is going to be the vocabulary that will get taken up when people are talking about Republicans and Democrats in conversation, when journalists are covering these issues in the media. And so the extent to which the Republican Party was successful in in getting supporters and getting the media to use the kind of vocabulary that they wanted them to use was very effective in being able to achieve electoral success, particularly for House races in 1992 and especially in 1994, when the Republicans took over the House of Representatives in a landmark repudiation of the Clinton presidency. This is a classic example of how strategically chosen vocabulary using patterns of naming and abstraction are used to try to convince people to embrace a particular way of looking at the world. This brings us to the concept of ideology. At the risk of oversimplifying what is a very complex theoretical and political concept, ideology can be basically defined as a coherent, integrated system of multiple interrelated political thoughts, beliefs, and values. Think about, for instance, the way in which, whether you see yourself as a Republican, a Democrat, a liberal, or a conservative, if you identify yourself as a citizen of the United States of America, chances are there are particular values and first principles that you think are most important when you think about politics and government that essentially are a political ideology that most Americans share. And the idea here is that symbol systems play a huge role in constructing and maintaining these ideologies. By using the same vocabulary to articulate the most important ideas over and over and over again, we develop a sense that certain aspects of reality should be taken for granted, that this is the way the world works and these are the ideals, these are the best ways that things should be. So you could give yourself a little thought experiment where you brainstorm what are the primary tenets of a political ideology for the United States of America. And what you're essentially going to be doing is brainstorming a vocabulary of those God terms: freedom, liberty, democracy, rule of law, prosperity, growth, equal opportunity. You see where this is going. The idea is if you use a consistent vocabulary and that vocabulary is consistently reinforced by those who are in positions of power and who can influence the public discourse, ideology is constructed and maintained by the ways we talk about these very important political abstractions. So the primary takeaways from this unit should be pretty clear at this point. First of all, words are symbols, and as symbols, they have arbitrary meanings constructed by social convention. Words don't have any natural, absolute, this has to mean that identity. They mean what they mean because the community of people who use those words decide that this is what they're going to be used for. And subsequently, the meaning of words as symbolic language is subject to negotiation and is subject to change. At the same time, we have to remember connotation, the idea that words can have rich, complex, and multiple meanings because of the various ways in which we interpret what they mean based on all of our past knowledge and experience, and importantly, our social interactions with others, including, of course, the use of shared symbolic communication through language. And finally, the idea that language has the potential to construct worldviews and ideologies that have political significance. Even though there's no necessarily natural meaning for any word, if the same kinds of words are used in similar contexts to mean similar things over and over and over again, members of a community tend to take that for granted as this is the way it's supposed to be. Until, of course, somebody else with a more compelling message is able to reconstruct and offer an alternative oppositional meaning to these concepts using different symbol sets. So that, in a nutshell, is symbolic language and ideology. If you have any questions about the content of this video or any of the videos in this series, please don't hesitate to reach out by leaving me a comment or contacting me directly. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.